Welcome back. Well, facing death is never easy, even if you know it is coming. Our next guest watched her friend battle terminal stage 4 melanoma and decided to document his journey, in part for him, in part for his family, but also in part for us to learn about what comes with it and the journey that follows along. Here to share the story of her friend's life, death, and legacy is Global Mail reporter and author of This Is Not the End of Me, Lessons on Living from a Dying Man. It is Dakshana Bascaramurty. Dakshana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Dakshana, you met Layton back in 2011 when you hired him to be your wedding photographer. So take us through how you went from that relationship to him becoming the central figure in your very first book.
I flew to Halifax for my wedding. That's where my husband's from. And we spent this magical day together, becoming very, very close. Just bonding on so many different levels. We had very similar senses of humor, outlooks on life. And then, it was bittersweet. This friendship could never really go anywhere because we lived in two different cities. And, we became Facebook friends, just sort of passively stayed in touch with each other. And a year after that, when I was in Toronto, I opened my email one day and found this email from Layton. And he explained that he'd been diagnosed with stage 4 melanoma. And I had a million questions for him because I knew that he was due to become a father in just a couple of months. And I wondered what was going on in his head and how he was going to deal with this terrible news.
When you think about a story like this, most authors might start it right where the diagnosis comes. But instead, you start this book where, he is laying on the hospital floor as his wife Candace is giving birth to their son, Finn. Why pick up the journey there?
I started this book with a pretty graphic scene. Candace is in labor, and Layton is just a few feet away from her, but there's a wall separating them. And he is administering an enema, which was part of a really radical alternative therapy he pursued for a few years. He didn't feel very confident in the odds of extending his life through traditional therapy, so he tried this out. And I really wanted to establish right at the beginning, in a pretty in-your-face way, what the stakes were here for him. So he was missing out in some ways on one of the most important, if not the most important moment of his life. But it was in pursuit of creating more time for himself, this bid to do this therapy and maybe extend his life so he could have as much time with his son as possible.
When loved ones pass away, we tend to really gloss over their faults, and it's understandable why we do that. But in this book, you really don't try to shy away from Layton's imperfections. Why was that important for you to show him sort of in his full personality?
What I wanted to establish with Layton right from the get-go was that, I was a journalist, and this was going to be at least I hoped it would be, the most honest portrait of what his life looked like and what the lives of the people around him looked like. And I was very fortunate in that he was the rare source who didn't put conditions on me at all. He said, anything I say to you, anything you observe is fair game. And something that I found so remarkable was, this really colored every part of how he lived his life and how he wanted, himself to be seen by people around him, specifically his son. So his son was only 3 years old when he died, but he was really committed to his son Finn knowing, the full portrait of who he was, flaws and all. And I think that was a very conscious parenting move on his part. He wanted his son to feel free to make mistakes and to grow as a person and to see how his father had done that himself.
Layton is obviously the focus of this book, but you really take the time to reflect how his family comes to grips with his mortality. So why was it important for you to show their perspective as well?
Well, Layton's family really sacrificed so much to try and keep him alive for as long as possible, especially when he was doing this alternative therapy. His parents were both retired, but, basically were put to work again, every single day, helping prepare juices and all of the meals for the special diet that he was on and just running and doing all of these errands for him because he was so weak and in many ways kind of isolated at home. And with his wife, it was the same thing, I think just imagining what it must be like to have a newborn at home while you're also, facing the fact that your husband is terminally ill and that he's doing this, again, very draining therapy. And so I wanted to show kind of how his diagnosis affected everyone in his life and also the relationships that changed over the course of these years.
My son is around the same age that Finn was when Layton passed. And one of the things that, was heartbreaking but really special in this book was, Layton's mission to fill a box of momentums as he came to grips with his mortality. What was that process like, kind of, as he was agonizing just what to put in this box?
It became this project that in some ways was very all-consuming, for several months of his life. He was so obsessed with getting the right mix of objects. And this project was meant to be something that was going to explain to Finn who he was. But obviously no box of objects could ever convey to a child, who their parent was. So, in some ways I was very moved watching him do this, but it was also really heartbreaking to watch because he was getting so frustrated, trying to assemble this perfect capsule that could never really even be perfect.
The subtitle of this book is Life Lessons from a Dying Man. So I'm wondering, what did you learn as someone who was watching and kind of along for the journey of someone else who was facing death?
There are sort of two phases to the years that I followed Layton. The first couple of years when he was doing this alternative therapy, especially, there was this desperation, at any cost, he just wanted to beat this and he wanted to extend his life. And then there was this turning point when he kind of switched into the second phase where the cancer spread to his brain. He gave up the therapy and he kind of came to terms with the fact that he wasn't immortal, that this was coming for him. And I really noticed a sort of slowing down of his life and, a changing of his priorities after he accepted this. And I think that a lot of us, even if we are healthy, could learn from that. This was, again, the guy who wanted to travel the world and go on adventures. And then, suddenly he threw out his bucket list and he said, what if we just lived for today and maybe even just for tomorrow? And there were so many small pleasures that he derived from this very simple existence.
I mean, there's one person who is yet to read this book, and that, of course, is Layton's son, Finn. Have you given any thought as yet as to how he might receive this book if he does choose to read it one day?
I hope that in some ways it helps him understand his father better, helps him understand the sacrifices his father made for him, the sacrifices his grandparents and his mother made, and just how much his mere existence, even though his life overlapped with Layton's for only a few years, just how much his existence changed his father.
Dakshana, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and also for writing a book that really does honor to your friend's Layton's legacy. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me on.
This Is Not the End of Me is available now. Go get yourself a copy. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back.